A Korean mafia boss trusted a black female bodyguard. By morning, she was the only one left standing after the betrayal. They dismissed her the moment she stepped through the gates. A black woman in tactical gear standing before Seoul's most ruthless crime lord. One lieutenant sneered in Korean about affirmative action gone wrong. Another muttered something crude about what foreign women were really good for. She caught every syllable. She understood every insult. She cataloged every face for the reckoning to come. When the hiring panel demanded proof of competence, she placed a single encrypted file on the table. It contained classified incident reports from the Secret Service. 3 assassination attempts, 2 heads of state, 0 casualties on my watch. Then the incident that ended everything. Senator's son who compromised the president's position. Because he was drunk and entitled, I removed him from the motorcade with appropriate force. They called it assault. I called it doing my job. My resume is written in politicians' lies. My credentials are buried under classified stamps and political favors. You don't hire me because you like me. You hire me because everyone else has already betrayed you. 5 days later, 40 armed men inside Minho's own compound would turn their weapons on him simultaneously. Security team, family advisors, trusted Lieutenant Saul coordinated, all bought. By dawn, every single betrayer would be dead or broken, stopped by the woman they'd mocked during her interview. If you believe loyalty is more valuable than comfort, hit subscribe right now. Only people who mistake prejudice for wisdom would scroll past this story. Park Min-ho had clawed his way from Busan's shipyards to Gangnam's penthouses through calculated brutality and strategic genius. The Baiko Syndicate, the White Tiger, controlled everything that moved money in Seoul: port operations, real estate development, cryptocurrency laundering networks, political campaigns. For 22 years, he had survived wars with rival families, investigations by prosecutors he didn't own yet, and 3 separate attempts by the Japanese Yakuza to absorb his territory. At 51, Min-ho is transitioning toward legitimacy, transforming blood money into venture capital, criminal networks into corporate boards. But legacy required trust. And trust, Min-ho was learning, was the most dangerous investment of all. It started with patterns his instincts recognized but couldn't name. Business partners suddenly unreachable as hard. Shipments delayed without explanation. Old allies requesting meetings in public places they'd never chosen before. Then came the Bodis, his nephew, shot during a routine security rotation despite being surrounded by bodyguards, who somehow saw nothing. A trusted accountant, dead in a car accident on a road he never traveled. His driver of 15 years, found with a bullet in his skull and a staged suicide note that mentioned gambling debts Min-ho knew didn't exist. Someone was systematically dismantling his inner circle. Someone who knew the rotation schedules, the communication protocols, the locations of safe houses that existed on no map. Someone close. The breaking point came when his head of security, Kwon Jae-soo, his adopted son, the boy he'd raised from nothing, handed him intelligence about a coordinated assault being planned for the business summit in 5 days. Jae-soo had uncovered communication between rival syndicates, corrupt prosecutors, even foreign intelligence agencies. They were all coordinating, all targeting Min-ho. We can't trust anyone outside this room, Jae-soo had said. Eyes steady, voice certain. We need someone external. Someone with no connections to Seoul's underworld. Someone no one would expect. Desperation makes powerful men consider impossible options. It made Park Min-ho, a man who had built his empire on Korean solidarity and cultural tradition, accept a recommendation that defied everything he believed: hire the American woman. Jasmine Carter wasn't looking for redemption the day everything changed. She was looking for anonymity, is something that had eluded her since the incident. That ended her Secret Service career. Seoul was supposed to be far enough, a city where her face didn't appear in political operatives. Whispered conversations, where the scandal that destroyed her reputation was just American noise that didn't translate across the Pacific, where she could take private security, contracts that paid in cash and asked no questions about the gap in her resume that officially didn't exist. The nightmares never stopped. Neither did the skills. She kept herself sharp through necessity, worked personal security for tech executives who needed someone who could blend into boardrooms and extract them from hostile situations. Trained at a gym in Itaewon where ex-military from 6 countries worked out their trauma on heavy bags and each other. Studied Korean with the same intensity she'd once studied threat assessment protocols because understanding the language meant understanding the context. And context meant survival. When the shots rang out at the cafe in Gangnam, Jazz was 3 tables away, finishing her second Americano and reviewing a contract offer from a hedge fund manager who needed security for his family. 4 gunmen, professional stance, coordinated entry, target, a businessman Jazz didn't recognize, but whose tailored suit and pale face suggested he recognized them. The cafe erupted into chaos. Customers screaming, diving under tables, baristas frozen behind the counter, the businessmen scrambling toward the back exit. Nobody looked at Jazz, just another foreign woman, probably a teacher or a tourist. No threat, no factor. Their fatal era. 18 seconds. That's all it took. The first gunman went down. When Jazz drove her knee through his elbow joint as he tracked his target, the weapon clattered across tile floor. The second turned toward the sound and caught her elbow across his tempura. Strike calculated for unconsciousness, not death. The third managed to fire twice before Jazz closed the distance, redirected his aim into the ceiling, and used his own momentum to drive him face first into the marble counter. The fourth was smarter. He kept distance, tried to acquire her as a target, but Jazz had already picked up the first gunman's weapon, cleared the chamber, checked the magazine, and put 2 rounds into his shoulder before he could process what he was seeing. 4 men neutralized. 0 civilian casualties. Businessmen alive and hyperventilating behind an overturned table. What Jazz didn't know, parked across the street in a black Genesis G90 with privacy glass sat Minho's most trusted advisor, conducting surveillance on the same businessman, a prosecutor who'd been receiving threats. He watched everything, recorded everything, and immediately made a phone call that would change the trajectory of both their lives. "We found someone," he told Minho over an encrypted line. "Someone impossible. Someone who doesn't belong to any of them." Park Minho's compound was designed to intimidate before it protected. 15-foot walls wrapped in security sensors, guard towers disguised as architectural flourishes, bulletproof glass that cost more than most Seoul apartments. The main house stock concrete and sharp. Angles looked more like a museum of power than a home. Everything about it screamed, approach with caution, leave with permission. When Jazz arrived for the interview wearing tactical boots, fitted cargo pants, and a jacket that concealed both her scars and her carry permit, the reaction was immediate. Guards at the gate exchanged glances heavy with disdain. One muttered in Korean, "Is this a joke? Did someone order entertainment?" Another laughed and said something far more vulgar about what foreign women were actually hired for. A third just stared, his expression making clear that he considered her presence an insult to their profession. Jazz understood every word. Her Korean was better than they assumed it always was. She filed each face into memory with the same clinical precision she'd once used to, memorized threat profiles and evacuation routes. There would be time later to address their assumptions. If she survived what was coming, the hiring panel waited in a conference room that felt deliberately sterile. Glass table, leather chairs, walls adorned with abstract art that probably cost more than Jazz had earned in the last 2 years combined. 5 men in tailored suits. No women. No other foreigners. Just the crystallized embodiment of everything Jazz had been fighting against her entire career. Kwon Ji-soo sat at the head of the table, expression perfectly neutral. To his right, Minho's brother, softer, clearly skeptical. Two other senior lieutenants flanked them. At the far end, Park Min-ho himself, watching Jazz with the same intensity she'd seen in Threat. Assessment subjects. Looking for tells for weaknesses. For the truth beneath the surface. Your credentials are? Ji-soo paused, scanning a tablet. Unusual, a decorated Secret Service agent. Then a sudden discharge. Classified circumstances. 3 years of private security. Work in Seoul under a work visa that shouldn't have been approved. He looked up. You understand why this raises questions. Jazz didn't blink. You understand why I don't answer them unless you're paying me to? Minho's brother scoffed. You speak to us like someone you called for help, Jazz interrupted, voice level. You don't set up interviews with ex-Secret Service operatives because everything's going well. You do it because bodies are dropping and you're running out of people you can trust. The room went silent. Ji-soo's expression flickered, surprise maybe, or reassessment. Prove you're worth the risk, Minho said. First words he'd spoken. Voice like gravel wrapped in silk. Jazz reached into her jacket slowly, watching the hands of 2 guards drift toward their weapons, and placed a small encrypted drive on the glass table. Libya, 2019, Fortified Intelligence Site. 47 hostiles. I was part of a 4-person extraction team sent to retrieve an asset before hostile forces breached their compound. She slid the drive toward Minho. Our team was compromised. 3 agents killed in the first 60 seconds. I completed the extraction alone, eliminated the immediate threat, and burned the site to hide the intelligence. Classified operation. Governments involved still deny it happened. She leaned forward slightly. What you'll find on that drive is documentation I wasn't supposed to keep. Satellite imagery. Casualty lists. The kind of proof that could end careers. If it surfaced publicly, her eyes locked with Minho's. Wanted credentials? My resume is written in classified ink and sealed under national security orders. My references are CIA handlers who'll deny they know my name. You don't hire me because you trust me. You hire me because everyone else in this room has already lied to you. The silence stretched. Minho's brother looked ready to erupt. Ji-soo's expression remained carefully blank. Too blank, Jazz noted. Classic control technique. Then Minho smiled. Not a warm smile. A predator recognizing another predator. You'll start immediately. Salary is non-negotiable. Living quarters will be on compound. You report only to me. He stood, buttoning his suit jacket. Survive the next 5 days and we'll discuss a permanent arrangement. As the meeting ended and Jazz was escorted out by stone-faced guards, she caught Ji-soo watching her. Not with hostility. With something far more dangerous. Calculation. Later that night, alone in the guest quarters, they'd assigned her sparse room. Single window with bulletproof glass. Camera in the corner she'd spotted immediately. Reviewed what she'd observed. The body language. The micro-expressions. The way Minho's brother had looked at Ji-soo before objecting to her hiring. The way the 2 lieutenants had exchanged glances when Minho made his decision, the way Ji-soo had positioned himself at the head of the table, not at Minho's side. Small details. Insignificant to most observers. To Jazz, they were fault lines in a foundation already cracking. She pulled out her phone and began documenting everything she'd seen, everyone she'd met, every word that had been spoken in Korean that they'd assumed she didn't understand. 5 days until the summit. 5 days until someone made their move. And Jazz would bet her life, which she essentially had, that the killer wasn't coming from outside the compound. The killer was already inside. Probably already standing behind Park Min-ho, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Park Min-ho learned about power the way most men learn about deaths suddenly. Violently and with no way to unlearn the lesson. He was 11 years old when his father's fishing boat was seized by the Busan Dockworkers Syndicate, not for debt, not for territory, but because his father had refused to pay tribute to men who produced nothing but fear. They beat his father in front of the other fishermen, made it theatrical, made it educational. Young Minho watched from behind a shipping container, hands clenched so tight his fingernails drew blood from his palms. His father never worked again, died 3 years later from injuries that never properly healed and pride that never recovered. The day they lowered his father into the ground, Minho made a choice that would define the next 4 decades. He didn't cry. He didn't pray. He found the youngest lieutenant in the syndicate that had destroyed his family and offered himself as an errand boy, 14 years old, small for his age, but with eyes that already understood the fundamental truth his father had died refusing to accept. The world belongs to men willing to do what others won't. By 16, Minho was running numbers for the syndicate. By 19, he was collecting debts with a baseball bat and a smile that never reached his eyes. By 23, he'd orchestrated the assassination of the man who'd beaten his father, made it look like a Yakuza incursion, and consolidated power before anyone realized. The errant boy had become the architect. The Baiko Syndicate, the White Tiger, was built on the bones of 7 rival organizations. Minho systematically absorbed or eliminated over the next 15 years. Port operations came first, controlling what moved in and out of South Korea's second largest city. Then real estate, buying up properties through shell companies before development deals were announced. Construction contracts that required insurance against labor disputes and accidents. Nightclubs that laundered money through bottle service. Receipts and VIP rooms where prosecutors and politicians made deals they'd deny under oath. By his mid-30s, Minho had transformed from a dockworker's son to a shadow emperor whose name appeared on no documents but controlled millions in assets. He was invited to charity galas he'd once dreamed of burning down. He sat in boardrooms with men whose fathers had ignored his father's pleas for mercy. He bought a penthouse and ganged him with a view of the Han River and furnished it with art he didn't understand but knew others would covet. Success, he discovered, was just another form of war. The battles simply moved from alleys to conference rooms, from knives to contracts, from blood to bankruptcy. At 45, Minho began the most dangerous transition of all: legitimacy. Venture capital firms that invested in tech startups, cryptocurrency exchanges that operated in regulatory gray zones but paid taxes on time, political contributions that came with no explicit quid pro quo, but everyone understood the implicit arrangement. He married late a woman from a respectable family who asked no questions about his past and expected no affection in their present. She gave him no children but provided the social credibility he needed. For the next phase, he adopted Kwon Ji-soo, a brilliant young man who'd lost his family to gang violence, trained him in business and brutality, and molded him into the son his wife never provided and his empire required. For 3 years, the transformation proceeded flawlessly. Criminal revenues declined as legitimate profits grew. Old enemies retired or died. New partners saw only the respectable businessman, not the young man who'd once broken fingers for late payments. Minho convinced himself he'd done the impossible, escaped the gravity of his origins, and ascended to a place where violence was no longer necessary. Then his nephew was shot in broad daylight, surrounded by bodyguards who saw nothing. His accountant died in an accident that defied physics. His driver was found dead with a suicide note in handwriting that wasn't quite right. Each death surgical. Each death sending a message: your transformation is an illusion. Your legitimacy is performance. Your empire is built on sand and the tide is coming. Minho recognized the pattern immediately because he'd designed it himself 20 years ago. This wasn't random violence. This was systematic dismantling. Someone was using his own playbook against him, eliminating the support structure before striking the foundation. Someone who knew his routine, his security protocols, his safe houses, his rotation schedules. Someone who understood that the most effective way to kill a king wasn't with a frontal assault, but by turning his own court against him. He ran the analysis like a business problem. Who had access? Who had motive? Who possessed both the patience for a long game and the ruthlessness to execute it? The list was long, too long. Rival families seeking revenge for old slights. Legitimate businessmen whose ventures he'd absorbed. Politicians whose corruption he'd documented as insurance. Even some within his own organization who'd been passed over for advancement or felt underpaid for their loyalty. At 51, Park Minho stood in his penthouse office watching the sun set over Seoul and realized the trap he'd built for himself. In seeking legitimacy, he'd made himself vulnerable to legal prosecution. In seeking respectability, he'd softened the edges that once kept enemies at bay. In seeking transformation, he'd created uncertainty about who he really was. An uncertainty in a criminal enterprise was the same as weakness. The final message arrived carved into his head of security's chest: full moon. Your last 5 days. Someone was done with subtlety. Someone wanted him to know death was scheduled, calculated, inevitable. They wanted him to feel what his father must have felt watching those men approach his boat. Certainty of powerlessness. The futility of resistance. But Minho had learned different lessons from his father's death than the ones his killers assumed. He'd learned that survival requires doing the unthinkable. He'd learned that pride is expensive and pragmatism is priceless. He'd learned that when everyone around you might be an enemy, you need an ally with nothing to lose. If you believe that the most dangerous traps are the ones we build for ourselves, hit subscribe now. Only people who've never had to choose between death and desperation would scroll past this next part. Jasmine Carter learned about loyalty on the day it destroyed her career. She was 29 years old, 5 years into the Secret Service, standing post outside a fundraiser in Alexandria, when Senator Bradley's son stumbled out of the venue drunk enough to be a liability and entitled enough to be a threat. He'd been flagged twice already that evening, once for aggressive behavior toward staff, once for attempting to access a restricted the area where the president was, receiving a security briefing. Both times, senior agents had smoothed it over. Senator's kid. Important donor. Keep it quiet. Handle it internally. The third time, he grabbed the arm of a junior staffer and tried to force her into a service corridor. Jazz was the closest agent. She assessed the situation. In the 2 seconds training had programmed into her nervous system, intoxicated male, superior strength, vulnerable victim, escalating aggression, she moved. The tackle was textbook. The restraint was by protocol. The 3 seconds it took to remove him from the venue and secure him in a holding area were executed with the precision she demonstrated in countless drills and 2 actual threat scenarios where her actions had saved lives. What wasn't by protocol was the senator's son's broken collarbone, or his dislocated shoulder, or his version of events delivered through lawyers and television interviews about an aggressive female agent who'd assaulted him without provocation because she had something to prove. Jazz was placed on administrative leave within 6 hours. The investigation took 3 weeks. The conclusion was predetermined before the first interview. Agent Carter had used excessive force against a non-threatening individual. Contributing factors included possible racial bias and career frustration, leading to aggressive behavior. The junior staffer she'd protected was transferred to a different department and refused to return Jazz's calls. The other agents present suddenly remembered the incident differently. Maybe the senator's son had just been loud. Maybe Jazz had overreacted. Maybe there were better ways to handle diplomatic situations. The discharge papers read resignation in lieu of termination, the unofficial message delivered by her former supervisor was clearer. Take the deal. Keep your pension, disappear, and never speak about what really happened. Senator Bradley was positioning for a presidential run. This story didn't fit the narrative. Jazz was 30 years old with a spotless record that had been retroactively tarnished, references who'd been instructed not to acknowledge her service, and the kind of reputation that makes employers ask careful questions while already knowing they won't hire you. She'd spent a decade training to be the person who stood between bullets and bodies. Now the only people who wanted that skill set were the ones who didn't ask questions because they already knew the answers would be uncomfortable. Soul happened because a former colleague felt guilty enough to make a phone call. Private security firm, mostly corporate work. Foreign clients who needed someone who understood Western security protocols but could operate in East Asian contexts. The pay was decent. The anonymity was better. The 12-hour flight gave Jazz time to convince herself this was a strategic retreat. Not running away, she landed at Incheon with 2 bags, a work visa that had required 3 months of paperwork and 1 very expensive lawyer, and the kind of optimism that comes from having nothing left to lose. The optimism lasted approximately 48 hours. Seoul was a city that made its rules clear through 1,000 small rejections. Landlords who suddenly had no availability when she showed up for apartment viewings, gym memberships that required additional documentation for foreign applicants, restaurants where service was slow and menus were never translated. Not hostility exactly, just the constant low-grade friction of being perpetually other. The security work was worse. Corporate clients wanted someone who looked like their idea of professional, which apparently didn't include a black woman with braids and shoulders that suggested she could actually do the job. She got assignments no one else wanted. Night shifts, difficult clients, positions where if something went wrong, her foreignness would be the convenient explanation. Jazz learned Korean with the intensity of someone who understood that language. Wasn't just communication, it was surveillance. She needed to know what people said when they thought she couldn't understand, what the guards muttered when she walked past, what the clients discussed when they assumed she was just decoration. Every insult, every dismissal, every assumption filed away in the part of her brain that used to catalog threat assessments and evacuation routes. She trained alone because the gyms where ex-military worked out. Their trauma weren't welcoming to women. Who could outlift half the men and outfight most of them? She ate alone because the bars where security contractors shared information and job opportunities somehow never had room when she walked in. She lived in her efficiency apartment in Itaewon, the foreigner district, where at least being out of place was the standard. 3 years of this. 3 years of being professionally competent and personally invisible. 3 years of taking contracts that paid enough to survive but not enough to escape. 3 years of telling herself she'd made the right choice while knowing she'd simply chosen a different form of punishment. The nightmares never stopped. Neither did the skills. Jazz kept herself sharp because the alternative was admitting that everything she'd sacrificed, the career, the reputation, the life she'd built had been for nothing. She ran the Han River Trail at dawn before the city woke up, practiced disassembly and reassembly with the Glock she legally couldn't carry but illegally wouldn't surrender. Reviewed tactical scenarios in her head while riding the subway, identifying exits and threats and variables. With the same automatic assessment that had once kept presidents alive, she was drinking her second Americano at a cafe in Gangnam, reviewing a contract offer from a hedge fund manager who needed family security, when the shots rang out. 4 gunmen, professional stance, coordinated entry, target acquisition that spoke to training and planning. The cafe erupted into chaos. Customers screaming, baristas frozen. A businessman in an expensive suit scrambling for the back exit with the kind of terror that comes from knowing exactly why someone wants you dead. Jazz had 3 seconds to make a choice. Stay invisible like she'd been doing for 3 years, or remember who she'd been before the betrayal, before the exile, before she'd convinced herself that survival was the same as living. 18 seconds later, 4 gunmen lay unconscious or wounded across the cafe floor. 0 civilian casualties. 1 businessman alive and hyperventilating behind an overturned table, and across the street in a black Genesis G90 with privacy glass, someone who'd been watching everything made. A phone call that would change both their lives. If you've ever wondered whether running from your past is the same as escaping it, hit subscribe right now. Only people who've never lost everything would scroll past what happens when Jazz stops running. Park. Minho's nephew died on a Tuesday afternoon in the most secure part of the compound, surrounded by 8 bodyguards who would all claim they saw nothing. His name was Park Jae-sung, 26 years old, being groomed to handle the legitimate business operations while Minho transitioned the empire toward respectability. Smart kid, clean record, the acceptable face of a family built on blood. The rotation schedule had him moving from the East Wing residential area to the main office for a financial review meeting. Standard route. Standard protection detail. 8 trained men with clear sidelines and overlapping fields of fire. Jae-sung was laughing at something on his phone, completely relaxed within the fortress walls, when the shot came. Single bullet. Through the temple. Ballistics would later determine it came from an elevated position, approximately 40 meters away, which meant someone had fired from inside the compound perimeter. The 8 bodyguards had 8 different explanations for why they'd been looking the wrong direction at the exact wrong moment. One claimed he'd been checking a suspicious noise. Another said his radio had malfunctioned. A third mentioned feeling dizzy and stepping away for water. 8 trained professionals. 8 convenient distractions. 8 synchronized failures. Minho arrived at the scene within 3 minutes, summoned from a meeting by the kind of urgent message that makes blood run cold. His nephew lay in spreading crimson on expensive Italian marble. The bodyguards stood in formation, weapons drawn, scanning for threats that had already vanished. Kwon Jisoo was directing the lockdown with calm efficiency, sealing exits, establishing perimeter, coordinating with surveillance, to review footage that would mysteriously show static interference. During the critical 15 seconds, this was the moment Minho understood with absolute clarity. His nephew's death wasn't the attack, it was the message. Someone wanted him to know they could reach into his fortress, into his family, into the heart of his protection, and kill with impunity. Someone wanted him to understand that every person standing around that body, from the guards to his adopted son, could be complicit. The security review happened in Minho's private office, soundproofed and swept for surveillance twice daily. Jisoo presented the initial findings with the kind of professional competence that had made Minho trust him with everything. 8 bodyguards interviewed. All passed polygraph. All had alibis for planning meetings. All demonstrated genuine shock and remorse. The working theory: external sniper, professional hit, possible inside information, but no direct betrayal. Minho listened to every word and believed none of it. He'd built his empire by reading what people didn't say. Jisoo's presentation was too polished. The guards' stories too synchronized. The footage malfunction too convenient. This wasn't external. This was wrought from within, carefully cultivated, patiently executed. "We need new security protocols," Jisoo said, pulling up organizational charts. "Fresh team, vetted personally. I recommend we bring in contractors from—" "I want the American woman," Minho interrupted. The room went silent. Jisoo's expression flickered just for a microsecond. It was something that might have been surprise, or might have been calculation. "Sir, with respect, this isn't the time for experimental hires. We need proven, I need someone who isn't already bought. Minho stood, walking to the window that overlooked the compound where his nephew had died. Someone who has no connections to Seoul's underworld. Someone who doesn't speak our language well enough to have been part of planning conversations. Someone who has everything to prove and nothing to gain from my death. A Black American woman, Jisoo said carefully, will not command respect from the security team. Cultural barriers aside, sir, the men won't. The men failed to protect my nephew despite 8-1 odds and perfect sightlines. Minho turned back, voice cold enough to drop temperature in the room. Their respect is worth precisely what it bought today. Nothing. The full security leadership meeting happened 2 hours later. 18 men in tactical gear and tailored suits, all with years of experience and proven loyalty. All being told their commander had decided to hire a foreign woman with no Korean underground experience to protect him during the most dangerous week of his life. The objections came immediately. Cultural incompatibility, language barriers, team cohesion, unknown background. One senior lieutenant suggested, with poorly disguised contempt, that perhaps the stress was affecting Minho's judgment. Another questioned whether the cafe incident had been staged, a setup to create false credentials. Jisoo remained diplomatically neutral, which was its own form of opposition. Minho, let them talk. Let them voice every concern and objection. Let them feel heard and respected in their professional opinions. Then he delivered the decision, with the same finality he'd once used to consolidate rival organizations. She starts tomorrow. Full authority. Reports only to me. Anyone who cannot work under her command can resign immediately with full severance and my gratitude for past service. No one resigned, but the resentment in that room was thick enough to choke on. Later that night, alone in his office with a glass of whiskey he wouldn't drink and a loaded handgun he'd started keeping within reach, Minho reviewed the security footage of his nephew's death for the 8th time. Watching the synchronized distractions, the convenient technical failures, the perfect timing that spoke to meticulous planning and inside coordination. He'd built his empire by trusting strategically and verifying constantly. He'd survived 2 decades by assuming everyone had price and planning accordingly. But this level of betrayal, systematic, patient, family required a different approach. He needed someone with no history to corrupt, no relationships to exploit, no cultural obligations that could be leveraged. He needed someone who understood protection not as business but as purpose. Someone who'd lost everything for doing the right thing and might be desperate enough to try again. He needed someone exactly like Jasmine Carter. Someone the old Park Minho would never have considered. Which meant she was either his salvation or the final trap closing around him. If you believe the most dangerous gambles are the ones made with no good options, hit subscribe now. Only people who've never faced impossible choices would scroll past what happens when desperation meets determination. Jazz spent her first 48 hours inside the compound doing what everyone expected her to do, failing. She asked questions that annoyed people, requested access to systems that weren't necessary for her role, studied security protocols with the kind of intensity that made the existing team exchange knowing glances about overcompensation and insecurity. What they didn't realize was that failure was her reconnaissance. Every eye roll told her who had patience and who had contempt. Every delayed response revealed who controlled information flow. Every synchronized answer to her questions about the nephew's death confirmed what she'd suspected from the moment she'd seen the crime scene photos. This wasn't about what people were saying. It was about what they'd rehearsed. The security logs were the first crack. Jazz requested footage from the cameras covering the nephew's route during the 72 hours before his death. Standard security review identified pattern breaks, unusual activity, anything that suggested planning. The log showed nothing unusual, which was exactly the problem. No maintenance workers in the corridor during that time frame. No cleaning staff. No deliveries. No irregular foot traffic whatsoever. For 72 hours. The most traveled corridor in the compound had apparently been pristine and self-maintaining. Jazz had worked enough security details to know that buildings don't work that way. Someone cleans. Someone maintains. Someone moves through spaces even when protocols say they shouldn't. She brought it to Jisoo during the morning briefing. The logs are too clean. We're missing. The corridor's restricted, Jisoo interrupted smoothly. Cleaning happens unscheduled. Maintenance windows that don't appear in security footage to reduce data. Storage requirements. Where's the maintenance schedule? Filed with facilities management. I can request it if you think. I think someone edited these logs. Jazz kept her voice level, professional. 3 days of zero maintenance activity in a high-traffic area means either we have different footage or someone cleaned the records. The room went quiet. 8 senior security personnel, all Korean men, all looking at the foreign woman who'd been on site for 2 days and was now accusing them of either incompetence or conspiracy. One lieutenant laughed, not cruel, just dismissive, the sound of someone humoring a child who'd said something naive. Agent Carter, Jisoo said with careful patience, our system logs are encrypted and backed up redundantly. Editing them would require access to multiple servers, administrative credentials, and extensive technical knowledge. You're suggesting a level of sophistication that I'm suggesting someone who knew the system well enough to make changes without triggering alerts. Jazz met his eyes. Someone internal. The temperature in the room dropped. Jisoo's expression remained professionally neutral, but Jazz caught the micro-expression that preceded it, the fractional tightening around his eyes. That meant she'd touched something true. I'll have our IT team review the logs for any anomalies, he said. In the meantime, perhaps focus on current security protocols rather than investigating completed incidents. Translation: stay in your lane. Do your job. Stop asking questions. Jazz nodded and said nothing more, but she started keeping her own logs, documented on a burner phone she'd bought in Itaewon with cash. Every inconsistency, every synchronized answer, every time someone's story matched too perfectly with someone else's version of events. The equipment failures started on day 3. The camera covering Minho's private dining room went offline during lunch, a power supply issue. That took 40 minutes to resolve. The secure phone line used for confidential calls developed static during a conversation with a prosecutor investigating rival syndicates. The East Wing motion sensors triggered false alarms 3 times in 6 hours, each time pulling guards away from primary positions to investigate empty corridors. Individual failures were explainable. Collectively, they formed a pattern. Someone was probing the system, identifying weaknesses, establishing precedent for technical problems so that when the real attack came, guards would assume it was just another malfunction. Jazz documented everything but voiced nothing. She'd learned in Washington that speaking truth to people invested in lies only makes you the problem. Instead, she started her own shadow protocols, walked routes at irregular intervals, positioned herself where she could observe both Minho and the people protecting him, studied faces during briefings, foretells that indicated foreknowledge or suppressed reaction. On day 4, she saved Minho's life by accident. She'd been in the kitchen reviewing the food, preparation protocols, who had access, what the chain of custody looked like, where vulnerabilities existed in the process between ingredients and consumption. The head chef had been cooperative but confused about why the new American bodyguard was interested in vegetable sourcing and dishwasher schedules. Jazz was documenting the cold storage access log when Minho's brother entered through the private family entrance. Park Minji, older by 3 years, softer around the middle, wearing the kind of expensive casual wear that signaled wealth without effort. He'd been vocal about Jazz's hiring during the security meeting, questioning both her qualifications and his brother's judgment. He didn't see her in the corner reviewing clipboards, didn't see her watch as he moved. 2. The tea service being prepared for Minho's afternoon meetings. Didn't see her note the small vial he pulled from his jacket pocket, the careful pour into the specific cup marked, with a subtle notation that only family would recognize. The way he glanced toward the door before pocketing the empty vial. Jazz moved before conscious thought completed. Training took, overclose the distance, secure the threat, neutralize the danger. She had Min Jae's arm twisted behind his back, and the vial recovered before his surprise could form into words. The commotion brought guards within seconds. Jusoo within 30 seconds. Minho himself within 2 minutes. Summoned by urgent calls that his brother was being restrained by the American bodyguard who'd apparently lost her mind. Jazz held position, Min Jae immobilized, vial held up for everyone to see. He poised the tea. 3rd cup from the left. The one marked for you. Min Jae started speaking rapidly in Korean, confused. Innocent, explaining he'd just been adding honey. This was insane. The woman was paranoid. Several guards moved toward Jazz with the clear intent of separating her from Minho's brother. Family was family. Foreigners were temporary. Test it, Jazz said quietly, eyes on Minho. Test the tea. Test the vial. Test everything before anyone touches that cup. The silence stretched. Minho's expression was unreadable. Jisoo stood with calculated neutrality, not defending Jazz but not condemning her either. Min Jae continued his protests, louder now, invoking family bonds and tradition, and the insult of being accused by an outsider. Test it, Minho repeated. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority. The lab results came back 40 minutes later. Aconite, wolfsbane. Enough to cause cardiac arrest within 2 hours. Symptoms easily mistaken for heart attack in a man of Minho's age and stress level. Enough to kill cleanly while allowing time for the poisoner to establish alibi. Min Jae was in custody before the results were fully processed. That night, Jazz stood in Minho's office while he poured 2 glasses of whiskey he actually intended to drink. "My brother," he said quietly. Not a question. Just stating the fundamental betrayal? Family. "I'm sorry," Jazz said, and meant it. "Don't be." Minho handed her a glass. "You did what everyone else in this compound failed to do. You saw what was true instead of what was comfortable. If you've ever wondered how deep betrayal can run when family turns poison, hit subscribe now. Only people who still trust their inner circle would scroll past what comes next. The attack came at 2:17 in the morning on Jazz's 6th day in the compound. Professional timing deep enough into the sleep cycle that even trained guards experienced diminished reaction time, late enough that attention spans drift toward shift change at dawn. Jazz was awake anyway, reviewing her burner phone. Documentation of inconsistencies. That now included 1 attempted poisoning and approximately 47 smaller anomalies that formed a pattern she couldn't quite articulate yet. The explosion took out the east wing perimeter wall with the kind of precision that spoke to military-grade explosives and intimate knowledge of structural vulnerabilities. Alarms shrieked. Guards mobilized toward the breach, exactly as expected, exactly as trained. Jazz was moving before the second explosion hit this one inside the compound, targeting the guest quarters where she'd been assigned. Close enough that the concussion wave threw her against the wall. Close enough that anyone monitoring her room would assume she'd been inside. Close enough to be personal. She rolled through the doorway as automatic. Weapons fire stitched the corridor where she'd been standing. 3 shooters, professional stance. Night vision grr, moving with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going and who they expected to find. Not the chaotic assault of outside attackers, the surgical precision of inside coordination. Jazz went low and silent, using the smoke and confusion to slip into the maintenance corridor. she'd mapped during her first 48 hours. The shooting continued in her quarters, sustained fire meant to eliminate a target, not suppress one. They thought she was still in there. They were making sure. The compound descended into controlled chaos. Jisoo's voice over the security channel was calm and authoritative, directing teams toward the breach, establishing perimeter, accounting for personnel. His tone carried no surprise, just professional response to crises, which was interesting because every guard Jazz had observed reacted to unexpected violence with at least a fractional increase in vocal stress. Jisoo sounded like a man executing a plan, not responding to chaos. Jazz stayed in the shadows of the maintenance level, moving through access corridors that didn't appear on standard security maps, but existed in every large building for the workers who kept infrastructure running. She could hear the firefight above her, the compound guards engaging the attackers who'd breached the perimeter. The exchange sounded almost choreographed, too measured, too controlled. Real combat was messier. She reached the security monitoring room through a ventilation access point that in building maintenance had shown her during her annoying questions about facility systems. The room was empty, everyone pulled to active response, which meant someone had been confident about timing and coordination. The monitors told the story. 8 screens showing different compound angles. The breach point at the east walls showed professional assault-shaped charges, coordinated entry, suppressing fire, but the body positioning was wrong. The attackers were advancing too slowly, taking cover too conservatively, engaging in a firefight that seemed designed to maintain contact rather than penetrate deeper. They weren't trying to win, they were providing theater. Jazz pulled up the footage from her quarters, watched 3 men enter with professional clearing techniques, watched them fire into the bedroom, bathroom, even the closet, watched them confirm the kill. With the kind of thoroughness that came from knowing this specific target needed to be absolutely eliminated, watched them extract with the same precision they'd entered. Then she pulled up the archived footage from the nephew's assassination, ran it frame by frame, through the 15 seconds of supposed technical interference. The system showed static, but Jazz had worked with enough surveillance equipment to know that true technical failure created specific patterns. This looked different. This looked like intentional corruption masking footage that existed, but had been hidden. She spent 20 minutes working through the encryption, basic for government systems, barely adequate for private security. The hidden footage appeared like a ghost emerging from static, crystal clear, showing exactly what she'd suspected. The nephew hadn't been shot from an external position. The bullet had come from behind him, from where his bodyguard stood. The footage showed the shooter's face for exactly 2 frames before clever editing had restored the static. Park Jae-sung had been killed by his own security, by a man who stood post every day, by a guard who took orders from Kwon Jisoo. Jazz was downloading the footage to her burner phone when the door opened. No warning. No footsteps. Just sudden presence. Jisoo stood in the doorway with a service weapon pointed at center mass. His expression carried no anger, no surprise. Just the calm assessment of someone who'd calculated variables and was now adjusting for an unexpected outcome. "You should have died in that room," he said quietly. "I have trust issues," Jazz replied, hands visible, phone concealed behind the monitor. "They've kept me alive before. The attack was necessary. Too many questions, too many inconsistencies you kept noting." He stepped further into the room, weapon steady. Min Jae was slappy, emotional. "But you're dangerous 'cause you actually see patterns. The nephew's assassination, the logs, the equipment failures. All you..." Jazz kept her voice level, buying seconds. "How long have you been planning this?" 3 years. Since Min Hel started talking about legitimacy and legacy, Jisoo's smile was cold. He built this empire on bodies and blood, then decided he wanted respectability. wanted to transform it into something clean. Something he could pass to his nephew instead of me, his actual son, in everything but paperwork. So you killed the nephew, turned his brother, systematically eliminated everyone loyal to him. Jazz shifted slightly, calculating distances and angles. The summit isn't a business meeting, it's an execution. Very good. Jisoo's finger moved toward the trigger. But you won't be there to warn him. Jazz moved as he fired, diving left. Rolling behind the server rack as the bullet sparked off metal where her chest had been, she came up throwing a monitor, heavy and angular, catching Jisoo across the shoulder hard enough to spoil his second shot. Then she was through the ventilation access, into the maintenance corridor, running into the dark places of the compound that Jisoo's careful planning hadn't accounted for. Behind her, alarms changed pitch. The external attack was repelled. The threat was neutralized, and somewhere in the compound, they were discovering that the American bodyguard had died in the assault. Her body, too damaged by explosives to identify immediately. A tragic loss during the defense of the compound. Except Jazz wasn't dead. She was underground, literally and figuratively, with proof of conspiracy in 3 days until a summit where 40 people planned to murder the man she'd been hired to protect. She was alone in a hostile compound where everyone thought she was dead, and the architect of betrayal was the man everyone trusted most. If you've ever wondered, what happens when the person you trust most is the one planning your death? Hit subscribe now. Only people who've never been betrayed by family would scroll past how Jazz fights back. Jazz spent the next 36 hours as a ghost in her own crime scene. The compound held a memorial service for her on day 7, brief, professional, the kind of acknowledgement given to contractors who die in the line of duty. Jisoo delivered remarks about her bravery and sacrifice. Several guards who'd mocked her during her interview stood with appropriately solemn expressions. Minho himself placed a single white chrysanthemum on the empty casket, his face carved from stone, revealing nothing. She watched it all from the maintenance sublevel through a ventilation grate, documenting faces and reactions with her burner phone. Who looked genuinely sorrowful, who looked relieved, who exchanged glances that lasted a fraction too long. Jisoo performed grief with the same professional competence he performed everything else. Appropriate emotion, proper duration, no excess that would seem theatrical. But in the 30 seconds after the ceremony ended, when he thought no one was watching, Jazz caught the expression that replaced his mask. Not grief, not relief, calculation. He was already moving to the next phase, adjusting for variables, executing the plan that her death was supposed to facilitate. The compound's infrastructure became Jazz Kingdom. She'd mapped it during her first week, the maintenance corridors, utility tunnels, crawl spaces above false ceilings, access points that existed for repairs and were forgotten by security protocols. She moved through the walls like a whisper, existing in the negative space between the compound's official architecture and its functional reality. Food came from the kitchen's waste stream, still wrapped items, discarded for minor imperfections. Staff meals left briefly unattended during shift changes. Water from maintenance taps in areas rarely visited. Sleep in 20-minute increments in storage rooms and mechanical spaces where no one had reason to enter. It was brutal and unsustainable. But Jazz only needed 3 days. 3 days until the summit. 3 days to gather proof and warn Min hell before 40 coordinated conspirators turned a business meeting into an execution. Jisoo's office was on the 3rd floor, corner position with views of both the main entrance and the gardens where Minsho took his morning walks. Security was standard keycard access, camera coverage, motion sensors after hours, not designed to stop someone who didn't exist and moved through walls. Jazz accessed it at 4 in the morning through a ceiling panel that opened into the space above, Jisoo's private bathroom. She had 17 minutes before the automated security sweep that checked locks and verified no interior movement. 17 minutes to find evidence of a conspiracy that had taken 3 years to build. The office was impeccably organized. Everything labeled, everything filed, the kind of systematic precision that made Jisoo effective and predictable. Jazz went straight for what people like him always kept: the insurance. The proof that if everything collapsed, he could demonstrate he'd been the architect. That his betrayal was strategic rather than opportunistic. The safe was behind a painting of a tiger, appropriately symbolic. Digital lock. 8 digits. Jazz tried the obvious. Jisoo's birthday. The compound's founding date. Minho's birthday. All failed. Then she tried the nephew's death date. The lock opened. Inside, organized in clear document folders with handwritten labels, was the complete blueprint of betrayal. Financial records showing payments from 3 rival syndicates over 30 months, encrypted messaging transcripts, thousands of them, coordinating everything from security rotations to equipment failures, photographs of meetings that should never have happened. Jisoo with the Jang family's underboss. Jisoo with a prosecutor known for targeting organized crime. Jisoo with a man as recognized from intelligence briefings as a Japanese Yakuza liaison. But the most damning evidence was the summit plan itself. A minute-by-minute breakdown. Which guards would turn? Which family members were complicit? Which exits would be sealed? Where Minho would be positioned? Who would fire the first shot? 43 conspirators, each with a designated role, each receiving payment upon completion. The coup wasn't improvised. It was choreographed with the precision of a military operation. Jazz photographed everything, every page, every transaction, every face in every photograph. Her burner phone's memory filled, then filled again after she deleted personal files to make space. This wasn't just evidence of murder. This was documentation of systematic dismantling. The complete transfer of an empire, built over 20 years, to a man who'd spent 3 years pretending to protect it. The financial scale alone was staggering. Jisoo had been siphoning funds for years, building war chests with money that Minho thought was invested in legitimate businesses. 20 million in payments to conspirators. 50 million in promised payouts after successful transition. Another 100 million in shared operations with the Jang family that would consolidate power across Seoul's underworld. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't even ambition. This was business. Cold calculation of someone who'd learned from Minho's own playbook and improved upon it. Eliminate the old guard. Co-opt the infrastructure. Present the transition as inevitable rather than violent. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the new order would already be established. Jazz was uploading the final photographs. When she heard it, footsteps in the corridor outside. Not the regular patrol. These were purposeful, headed directly for Jisoo's office. She checked the time, 4:14. 3 minutes past her extraction window. The keycard reader beeped. The door opened. Jazz was already moving back toward the ceiling panel when she heard Jisoo's voice. Not alone, speaking in Korean with someone whose accent suggested Busan origins and Yakuza training. The American's body? The other voice said. You're certain? Confirmed by explosion trauma. Too damaged for open casket. Jisoo moved to his desk, directly below where Jazz balanced on ceiling joist, phone still recording. The memorial was necessary for morale. Minho took it harder than expected. He trusted her more than you anticipated. He trusted someone who had no reason to betray him. Refreshing novelty. Jisoo's tone carried dark amusement. But dead foreigners tell no tales. The summit proceeds as planned. 2 days. Jazz held absolute stillness as they continued discussing details, guard rotations, weapon placement. The exact moment when Minho would realize everyone around him had turned. She recorded every word, every confirmation, every piece of evidence that would be needed to expose this. When they finally left, Jazz remained motionless for another 10 minutes, controlling her breathing. forcing her heart rate down through sheer discipline. Then she extracted through the ceiling, moved through the walls, and returned to her hiding space in the sublevel with proof that would either save Minho's life or get them both killed. She had the evidence. She had the timeline. She had 48 hours to figure out how to warn a man who thought she was dead, that everyone he trusted most was planning his murder. And she had to do it while moving through a compound where 43 people were actively preparing to commit coordinated assassination. The hard part wasn't gathering proof. The hard part was figuring out who could still be trusted when trust itself had become the weapon. If you've ever discovered that everything you believed was a carefully constructed lie, hit subscribe now. Only people who still think they know who their enemies are would scroll past what happens when Jazz has proof but no allies. The summit began at 8 in the evening with all the ceremony of a funeral, disguised as a celebration. Minho had spent the day in meetings that Jazz watched through ventilation grates and hidden cameras, seeing him move through the compound with the weighted exhaustion of a man who knew something was wrong but couldn't identify the source. He'd asked about her twice, once directly to Jisoo, inquiring about arrangements for her family, and once to a senior lieutenant, mentioning how she'd saved his life and deserved better than dying for his mistakes. The guilt in his voice was authentic. The man who'd built an empire on calculated violence genuinely mourned the death of someone who'd been loyal for 6 days. Jazz documented it all. Another piece of evidence about who Minho actually was beneath the reputation, someone who valued loyalty more than convenience, which was exactly why this betrayal would destroy him. The main hall had been transformed for the occasion. Long table positioned in the center, capable of seating 30. Crystal chandeliers providing theatrical lighting. Bulletproof windows disguised as regular glass. Jazz had checked the specifications during her first week. The room was designed to impress visitors and remind them they were in a fortress. Tonight it would function as a cage. Guests arrived in coordinated intervals. Rival family representatives who should have been enemies, sitting together with the false civility of negotiated peace. Prosecutors who'd built careers prosecuting organized crime, now sharing whiskey with the subjects of their investigations. Foreign intelligence contacts who operated in shadows, now visible and comfortable. Each arrival had been vetted by Jisoo personally. Each had passed through security carrying weapons they weren't supposed to have. Jazz watched from above, positioned in the crawl space, between the main hall's false ceiling and the actual structural roof. She'd spent 6 hours getting into position, moving through maintenance corridors, with the proof she'd gathered and a plan that had approximately 30 points of failure. The burner phone was charged and ready. The evidence was uploaded to 3 separate secure servers with deadman switches. If she didn't input codes at specific intervals, everything would automatically forward to law enforcement, media outlets, and Minho's few remaining legitimate business partners. But evidence wouldn't save him if he was already dead. Minho entered at 8:15, flanked by Jisoo and 4 senior guards who Jazz now knew from the summit plan were all conspirators. He wore a dark suit that probably cost more than most cars, moved with the controlled power of someone who'd survived 20 years at the top, and carried himself like a man attending a negotiation he expected to win. He had no idea he was walking into an execution disguised as diplomacy. The seating arrangement was surgical. Minho at the head of the table, position of honor and authority. Jisoo to his immediate right, trusted advisor, protective position. The 4 guards positioned at cardinal points around the room's perimeter. 30 guests arranged down both sides of the table, each carefully placed based on the summit plan Jazz had photographed. Those closest to Minho were the ones designated to fire first. Those near the exits were assigned to seal the room. Those in the middle would provide covering fire and ensure no one escaped to tell the story. Jazz's position above gave her clear sight lines to the entire hall. She could see faces, read body language, identify the micro-expressions that preceded violence. She'd spent years protecting people from threats that came from outside. Tonight, she'd have to protect someone from threats that came from every direction. Simultaneously, while officially being dead and having no weapons except the element of surprise, the meeting began with traditional formalities. Min-ho welcomed the representatives, acknowledged past conflicts, spoke about the future of Seoul's underworld moving toward cooperation rather than competition. His speech was gracious and strategic, the kind of address that would have been impressive if everyone listening wasn't planning to murder him before dessert was served. Jazz watched the guards. Watch them not watch the room the way security should. Watch them watch each other waiting for the signal. Watch their hands drift toward concealed weapons with the unconscious preparation of people mentally rehearsing upcoming violence. The signal, according to the summit plan, would be Jisoo's toast, a specific phrase about new leadership for a new era. That would trigger the coordinated draw. Jazz positioned herself directly above that section of table, removed the ceiling panel with surgical quietness, and waited for the moment that would define everything. Dinner was served at 8:45. French cuisine prepared by a chef who had no idea he was catering an assassination. The irony wasn't lost on Jazz. They'd spend 20 minutes eating expensive food before attempting murder, because even Betrayal had protocols and civilized appearances to maintain. Min-ho ate slowly, occasionally engaging in conversation with guests who smiled and nodded while calculating bullet trajectories. Jisoo remained attentive and professional, the perfect second in command, playing his role until the exact moment he'd practiced for 3 years. At 9:13, Jisoo stood with his wine glass raised. The room went quiet with the kind of attention that comes from collective anticipation rather than respect. 30 people knew what was about to happen. 4 guards shifted their stance imperceptibly. Min-ho looked up at his adopted son with trust. That was about to be shattered, along with his life. "I'd like to propose a toast," Jisoo began, his voice carrying perfect authority and false warmth. "To Park Min-ho, who built this empire through vision and violence, who transformed blood into business, and who taught me everything I know about power." Min-ho smiled, genuinely touched, completely unaware. "And to new leadership," Jisoo continued, his tone shifting just enough that Min-ho's expression flickered with the first hint of confusion. "For a new era." The words hung in the air for exactly half a second. Then 30 hands moved toward 30 concealed weapons with the synchronized precision of rehearsed choreography. The 4 guards drew simultaneously. Jisoo's own hand moved toward the service weapon at his hip. 30 people who'd smiled and eaten and pretended suddenly revealed themselves as coordinated executioners. Min-ho's face showed the kind of betrayal that transcends shock, the fundamental shattering of reality when everyone you trust simultaneously tries to kill you. He started to stand, started to reach for his own weapon, started to do something that would have been utterly futile against 40 armed conspirators. In an enclosed space, Jazz dropped through the ceiling panel with a flashbang grenade she'd assembled from components stolen over 2 days from the compound's armory. The explosion was less lethal than theatrical, designed to blind and disorient rather than kill. But in the 3 seconds of chaos it created, while 40 people tried to reorient their vision and locate the threat they thought was dead, Jazz landed on the table between Min-ho and the guns pointed at him. "Everyone who wants to live," she said into the shocked silence that followed the flashbang's echo, "puts their weapons down now." 40 faces turned toward her. 40 expressions cycling through disbelief, confusion, recognition, and then cold calculation about whether one dead bodyguard could actually stop an entire coordinated coup. Jisoo recovered first, weapon now fully drawn, pointed directly at Jazz's center mass. "You should have stayed dead," he said quietly. "I have trust issues," Jazz replied. "They keep saving my life." If you've ever wondered What happens when one person faces 40 coordinated killers? Hit subscribe now. Only people who've never had to. Choose between impossible odds and certain. Death would scroll past the final stand. The flashbang gave Jazz exactly 4 seconds of advantage before training, and survival instinct overrode disorientation. She used 3 of those seconds to drag Minho off his chair and behind the overturned table that now served as minimal cover. The 4th second she spent throwing a smoke canister homemade from compound cleaning supplies and stolen ammunition. Propellant that transformed the main hall into chaos. 40 weapons fired into smoke and confusion. Bullets sparked off the crystal chandelier, shattered the bulletproof windows that were supposed to contain violence, tore through expensive upholstery and French cuisine that would never be finished. But Jazz and Minho were already moving, using the smoke as cover to reach the service entrance. She'd mapped during her first week the passage the staff used to deliver food, the corridor that didn't appear on security briefings because it was beneath the notice of people who planned in conference rooms. Stay close, Jazz commanded, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who'd protected presidents and understood that survival meant following instructions. Without question, don't speak, don't stop, trust nothing you see. Behind them, Jisu's voice cut through the chaos with cold precision. Seal the exits. She knows the compound, but she doesn't know the new protocols. Thermal imaging, motion sensors. Every corridor is covered, except the ones that existed for maintenance and plumbing. And electrical work? Infrastructure that kept buildings functioning, but security teams always overlooked. Jazz pulled Minho into the service corridor as the main hall's lights came back on, revealing empty space where their bodies should have been. The sound of coordinated pursuit began, and immediately, professional and methodical, the sound of people who had trained for this exact scenario. Jazz had spent 2 days preparing the compound for urban warfare. Small modifications that looked like maintenance issues, a loosened railing on the 3rd floor walkway, cleaning solutions spilled on marble, stairs that dried clear but remained lethally slippery, electrical panels with covers that appeared secure but would swing open with minimal force. She'd learned in Black Ops that the best traps were the ones that looked like accidents. The first guard caught up to them on the 2nd floor maintenance corridor, moving fast and confident with his weapon raised. He never saw the modified fire extinguisher Jazz had positioned at eye level, rigged with a pressure release. That turned it into a projectile when the corridor door opened. The impact took him down without a shot fired. Jazz kept moving, pulling Minho through doorways and corridors that existed in the space between official architecture and functional reality. How many? Minho asked, his voice steady despite the circumstances. A man who'd survived 20 years in criminal enterprise understood. That panic was more dangerous than bullets. 43 when I counted, Jazz replied, listening to footsteps and radio chatter that told her pursuit patterns. But some will break when they realize this isn't going as planned. Fear is contagious when people are dying for someone else's ambition. The 2nd and 3rd guards found them in the West Wing's stairwell, or thought they had. Jazz had spent 6 hours rigging that particular location with tripwires made from fishing, line, and construction materials. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs and furniture, buying precious seconds that Jazz converted into distance and tactical advantage. But the compound was only so large, and 40 coordinated hunters with thermal imaging and radio communication would eventually corner 2 people who couldn't hide forever. Jazz needed to shift from defensive evasion to offensive disruption. She needed to make the hunters afraid of being hunted. The compound's electrical system became her weapon. She'd mapped every junction box, every circuit breaker, every point where cutting power would create darkness that favored someone who'd trained for night operations. Lights went out in sections, not all at once. which would trigger backup generators, but strategically, creating pockets of shadow that turned familiar corridors into hostile territory. Guards started dying in those shadows, not from gunfire. Jazz had avoided taking weapons from fallen conspirators, because gunshots would reveal her position. Instead, she used the compound itself. A guard pushed down an elevator shaft she'd disabled. Another caught in a service door she'd rigged to slam with enough force to break bones. A third incapacitated by industrial cleaning chemicals she'd mixed into an improvised weapon that would have horrified her Secret Service instructors and impressed her Black Ops trainers. The psychology of it was as important as the tactics. Each death that looked like an accident made the survivors question their coordination, their intelligence, their assumption that numbers guaranteed victory. Radio chatter shifted from confident pursuit to nervous position checks. People who'd signed up to murder one man during dinner were now dying in darkness to a woman who wasn't supposed to exist. Jisoo's voice over the security channel revealed frustration, bleeding through professional control. She's one person. 40 of you against one contractor who should be dead. Lock down the compound completely. Every exit, every window, every ventilation shaft large enough to crawl through. But he'd made the critical error. The men like him always made, assuming competence was about numbers rather than commitment. Jazz had been outnumbered her entire career. As a Black woman in the Secret Service, as a contractor in Seoul's all-male security culture, as a bodyguard hired to protect a man whose entire organization wanted her to fail. Being outnumbered was her default state. She'd learned to weaponize it. By midnight, 12 of the original 43 conspirators were down dead, unconscious, or too injured to continue pursuit. The remaining 31 were scattered across a compound that had transformed from fortress to trap, hunting a target who knew every corridor and crawl space better than they knew their own operational plans. Jazz and Minho holed up in a storage room near the old boiler system, one of the few spaces not covered by surveillance because it predated the modern security installation. Minho sat with his back against industrial shelving, processing the betrayal with the kind of control that came from decades of calculated violence. "Jisoo," he said quietly. Not a question, just acknowledgement of what Jazz's survival and the coordinated assault had already proven. 3 years of planning, 43 conspirators, financial backing from rival, families and foreign, intelligence. Jazz showed him the phone with photographed evidence. Your nephew, your brother, every security failure, all coordinated, all leading to tonight. Minho studied the photos with the same intensity he probably once used to study rivals before, eliminating them. "My son," he said finally. "The boy I raised, taught everything. The boy you overlooked for legitimacy?" Jazz corrected. "Not cruel, but factual. You built an empire on blood and then decided you wanted it clean. Wanted to pass it to your nephew instead of the person who'd been loyal for 20 years. He saw that as betrayal before you saw it as evolution." Minho's expression hardened into something that had probably terrified rivals for 2 decades. Then he's learned his lessons well, and now he'll learn the final one, that betrayal has consequences, even when it's successful. The hunt was about to become mutual. If you believe that, sometimes the person who seems weakest is actually the most dangerous. Hit subscribe now. Only people who confuse numbers with power would scroll past the ending. Dawn was still 3 hours away when Jisoo made his final miscalculation. He'd spent the night consolidating the remaining conspirators, pulling them back from hunting through the compound to establishing a perimeter around the main hall where this had all started. 31 people transformed from hunters to defenders, waiting for 2 targets to make a desperate break for exits that no longer existed. What Jisoo didn't understand, what men who plan Betrayal in conference rooms never understand is that the person with nothing left to lose has already won the psychological war. Jazz had been dead for 3 days, according to official records. Minho's empire was already destroyed from within. They weren't trying to escape. They were coming to finish what Jisoo had started. The compound's security system became Jazz's announcement mechanism. At 3:17 in the morning, every speaker, every screen, every communication device simultaneously broadcast the evidence she'd gathered. Financial transactions showing Jisoo's payments from rival syndicates. Photos of secret meetings with enemies who should have been killed on site. The summit plan with all 43 names, roles, and payment schedules. And finally, the hidden footage of the nephew's assassination crystal clear, showing exactly which guard had fired and exactly who had given the order. The psychological impact was surgical. Conspirators who'd believed they were part of a successful coup suddenly saw their names and crimes broadcast to everyone, saw proof that Jisoo had been documenting everything, which meant he could betray them, just as easily as he'd betrayed Minho, saw that their anonymity and safety had been illusions maintained. Only as long as they were useful, the perimeter started fracturing within minutes. Guards who'd signed up for a coordinated assassination during dinner hadn't. Prepared for extended siege warfare against a target who knew their names and had evidence of their crimes. Some tried to flee. Some tried to negotiate. Some turned on each other in the kind of paranoia that comes from realizing your co-conspirators are documented liabilities. Jisoo's voice over the security channel carried the first real emotion. Jazz had heard from him in days rage mixed with something that might have been respect. You should have stayed dead and taken your proof with you. Now you've just guaranteed that everyone in this compound dies tonight. Not everyone, Jazz replied, her voice broadcasting through the same system. Just the people who chose betrayal over loyalty. The difference between you and me, Jisoo, is that I've always known the cost of doing the right thing. You're just learning it now. She cut the feed and turned to Minho, who'd spent the last hour transforming from shocked victim back into the man who'd built an empire. Through calculated violence, the main hall. He'll make his stand there because it's symbolic. Where he tried to kill you is where he'll try to prove he should have succeeded. They moved through the compound using routes that didn't exist on any security map. Past bodies of conspirators who'd fallen to Jazz's traps and Minho's cold execution of people who'd once called him boss. The compound had become a graveyard of betrayal, not just Jisoo's betrayal of Minho, but the smaller betrayals that had enabled it, guards who'd looked away, advisors who'd stayed silent, family members who'd chosen ambition over loyalty. The main hall was exactly where Jazz predicted, but the confrontation was smaller than expected. Most of the conspirators had fled or died or been abandoned by Jisoo as liabilities. Only 7 remained, the core group who'd been with him from the beginning, who had nowhere to run because their crimes were too documented and their betrayals too complete. Jisoo stood at the head of the table where Minho had sat hours ago, weapon drawn, flanked by the 6 who'd chosen to die with him rather than face the alternative. He looked at Minho with something that might have been regret or might have been resentment. That his father figure had forced him to this point. You taught me everything, Jisoo said quietly. Built an empire on violence and then acted surprised. When I used your methods against you? You wanted legitimacy. Wanted to wash blood off your hands and pretend it made you clean? I wanted what you built, the real power, not the performance. You wanted what you thought I had, Minho corrected. Moving forward with the kind of control that came from accepting inevitable violence. But you never understood. That power without loyalty is just violence with better funding. You bought 43 people. I earned one. The firefight lasted 18 seconds. Jazz had spent her entire career training for the moment when bullets fly and decisions happen faster than conscious thought. She moved with the kind of precision that comes from protecting people against threats that want them dead, targeting weapons, eliminating threats in order of lethality, using the table and chairs and architectural features as both cover and weapons. Minho fought with the brutal efficiency of someone who'd survived 2 decades through violence rather than rhetoric. He didn't hesitate, didn't negotiate, didn't offer mercy to people who'd eaten at his table and then tried to execute him. The 6 loyalists fell in seconds, some to Jazz's precision, some to Minho's rage, all to the fundamental miscalculation that numbers matter more than commitment. Jisoo went down last, weapon falling from hands that had signed documents and given orders and built a conspiracy that had collapsed in a single night. He looked up at Minho from the floor, blood spreading across the expensive suit he'd probably bought with embezzled funds, and asked the question that didn't need answering. Why her? Why trust a stranger over your own son? Because she had nothing to gain from my death, Minho said simply. And you had everything. The shot was clean, professional, the kind of execution that men like. Minho had been delivering for 20 years. Jisoo died in the same hall where he'd planned to become a king, killed by the father he'd tried to betray and the bodyguard he'd tried to eliminate. By dawn, the compound was silent in the way that only violence can create. 43 conspirators dead or fled or in custody of the few legitimate authorities. Minho still controlled an empire decimated from within, reduced to rubble and bodies, and the kind of silence that follows when everything you built proves to be illusion. Jazz and Minho stood in the main hall as sunrise filtered through shattered, bulletproof windows. 2 people who'd survived a night that should have killed them both. She was a bodyguard who'd been dismissed and underestimated and left for dead. He was a crime boss who'd learned that transformation requires more than intention. It requires loyalty that can't be bought. I can't pay you what you're worth, Minho said finally, exhaustion and acknowledgement in his voice. Everything I built is compromised or destroyed, but I can offer you something more valuable than money. What's that? Jazz asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear him say it. Partnership. Not employment. Not contract work. Actual partnership in whatever comes next. He looked at the evidence of betrayal surrounding them. I built this empire alone. That was the mistake. Help me build something different. Something that values loyalty over convenience. Where trust isn't a transaction but a foundation. Jazz considered the offer while watching sunrise illuminate a compound that looked like a war zone because it had been one. She'd spent 3 years in Seoul being underestimated and dismissed and treated as temporary. She'd lost her career in Washington for doing the right thing. She'd been hired to protect a man everyone wanted dead and had succeeded despite literally everyone working against her. She could walk away, take the evidence she'd gathered and disappear into anonymity again, or she could stay and build something with the one person who'd valued her loyalty when everyone else had dismissed her capability. One condition, Jazz said finally. No more secrets. No more inner circles. No more family getting special treatment because of blood instead of competence. If we're building something different, we do it with eyes open and standards that don't bend. Minho extended his hand, not as boss to employee, but as partner to partner, as survivor to survivor, as 2 people who'd learned the same lesson at the same brutal night that loyalty earned through action is worth more than power bought through betrayal. Jazz shook his hand as the sun rose over Seoul, illuminating the last 2 people, standing in a compound full of ghosts and the promise of something built on foundation that couldn't be bought or betrayed. If you believe that real power comes from loyalty that can't be purchased, share this story. The world needs to know that sometimes. The person everyone underestimates is the only one worth trusting when everything falls apart.